Hi all, in this lab, let us understand how to create a first REST API. Okay, now let us create a sample REST API with API gateway. Let's get started. So we have AWS Cloud, and within that, we are going to create our first API gateway. The type of the API that we are creating is REST API. There are two types. One is a REST API, other is the WebSocket. Okay. Now we are creating the REST API and the name of the API is calculate price. Okay. And the type of the endpoint that we're creating for this API is called regional. Okay. So we have different other options as well. Like we have private APIs, regional APIs and edge APIs. So for this demo, we are only creating the regional API. Okay. Then the name of the method that we are creating in this API is called slash price per meter. Okay, so this is the endpoint that we are creating it. And the integration for this API is the Lambda. So that means we are using a Lambda integration for the backend, okay, to implement the functionality for this API. Okay, now how does it work? So the clients will be sending the request to this API called slash price per meter and the initial data that the clients will send is called the method request. So within the method request, the client will send some data like price, size, unit, down payment, and this is very subjective, very specific to each API that we are implementing it. Okay. So in this case, the client is sending a JSON file with price details and down payment and few details. Now, once the request gets this data, then what we have is called an integration request. So this is where the API gateway can do some transformation if required on the incoming data and send that to the backend, which is the Lambda. Okay, so in our case, we are not doing any transformations. We are sending the request as it is, the same payload that the method request contains. The same thing is sent via integration request. Okay, now once Lambda receives this, then it will do the process based upon the business logic and it will send the response back. And this response is called integration response because the integration here is Lambda. So the integration request is input to the Lambda. The integration response is from the output from the Lambda. Okay. Now, once the response comes from the integration, which is the Lambda, the API gateway can do some further processing on that. That is called method response. So in our case, we are not doing any transformation in this lab. The same response which comes from the Lambda is sent to the clients. Okay. So this is a very simple API gateway example. We are just creating a REST API, implementing one method, okay, which is called price per meter and sending a input request and getting the response back from the backend. Okay, and the type of the API that we are creating inside the API gateway is post API. Now that we will see in the code. Okay, let's go to the source code. This is the source code for the Lab1, which is API gateway REST API. Create your first API. Okay, now let us first look at some source code before we deploy this stack. Okay, now let's go to API gateway.tf file. Here we are creating the first API, which is the REST API. Okay, the name of the API is called calculate price, and the type of the endpoint that we are creating for this API is called regional. Okay, now we will be creating one resource. Okay, the name of the resource is price per meter. Okay, and this is the name that we have to provide as a part of the path underscore path field. Okay, so if you look at the REST API, so this is the top level API and this is the parent ID. Okay, now what we need to do is let us go to the method. Okay, so the name of the type of the method is called post method. Okay, and there is no authorization. We are not creating any authorization here. Okay, so that means the requests which are coming to this endpoint will not require any authorization. So every request will be authenticated automatically. So this is the configuration, the default example. Okay, so method request. Now let us go to the method response. Okay, so we have to create an integration. Okay, for this API and the type of the integration is called AWS and the integration method is post. Okay, and the name of the Lambda function is in this particular module that we're going to see now. And the required request templates is null because we are not doing any transformation. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind. Now let's also go for the integration response and the method response. So this is the integration response. So here also we are using a dummy or the null templates. We are not providing any template. Okay. So the method response is also default status 200. We are not doing any changes here. Okay. Now we have to create one stage for this API and the name of the stage is dev. Okay. So ignore all other configuration for now. For the lab1, we'll not be using any one of the settings. And for the stage, we have to create a deployment. So here in the triggers field, I mentioned multiple configuration. So if any one of these configuration changes, the deployment will happen automatically. So that is the intention here. Okay. Now there are few settings at the method level which we'll ignore for now. We will look at them later. Now, apart from that, I'm also creating some logs, okay, for the log groups basically for the account level for this API. So these are certain permissions. So IAM permissions to create the IAM role. So all of this I'll ignore for now. Okay. Now let us go to the console and deploy this API. So let us do Terraform init. Now we'll do Terraform plan. Okay. Now let us do Terraform auto apply with auto approve. This will not take much time. I've run this already. Let's wait till it completes. Okay, Terraform apply completed. So you look at the outputs. Okay. So the REST API dev resource invoke URL is this. So this is the API ID and this is the execute API is a service, API gateway service. This is a region name and this is the dev slash dev is the stage and this is a price per meter is the actual endpoint that we are going to invoke. Okay. Now let us go to the console and see how this looks like. Okay. So in the AWS console, if I go to the API gateway service, you will see that there is one API called calculate price and this is the ID of the API and this is a REST API. Okay. And the type of the endpoint is regional. Okay. Now within this API, we have multiple resources. Okay. Let us first look at the price per meter for this demo. So the type of the method that we are creating is post method. Okay. So this is a resource name and within the resource we are creating one method and the method is of type post. Okay. The integration type is lambda. That means the backend is lambda. Now we are not doing any authorization and also we are not using any API key. Okay. For this lab. Now if I click further on the post method, there are a lot of configuration available. So let's look at the method request. So authorization is null, none. Request validation is also none. We are not using any of them. Even API key is also false. And most of the other configuration is just default, empty. Okay. Now integration request is where we provide the type of the integration is lambda. And we are basically using this lambda function. Okay. And the input pass-through is also an important configuration we have to keep in mind. When there are no templates defined, just pass as it is. Okay. The input data. The mapping template also it is basically nil. Okay. Now let us go to the lambda function, which is implementing this backend. Okay. So the calculate cost per unit lambda function is basically invoked by API gateway and it is implemented in Node.js. So it's a simple function to return some cost details for this API. Okay. Now this is the runtime. Node.js is a runtime and this is index and few other details, architecture and the runtime configuration, things like that. Okay. So let us go back to the console, and here integration response, you can see I created the default response 200, and most of the configuration is default. Content handling is pass through, default mapping is true, here also empty, and in the method response also it's a default configuration. Now what we will do is, let us go to the test. So this is an easier way to test your APIs before you deploy, and before you even pass your API URLs to your clients for testing, you can do the testing within the console itself. Okay. Now let us provide some inputs. The query string we have not defined. Headers also we have not defined any specific headers. The input request, the request body, let us enter some data. Now let us go to the console and get the sample data. Okay. So in our example, we are going to use one sample request. Okay. So this is the sample JSON file that we'll be using for testing purpose. So there is a test button. So if you click the test button, you will see that the response is coming fine. Now let's spend a minute to analyze. See, this is a response body. This is what the clients will see at the end. Okay. The status code is 200. This is the body of the response coming from Lambda, and these are the headers coming from the Lambda. Now, if you wanted to see how things are happening, you can see the entire logs. Okay. So starting the execution for per request, and request path, query, headers are null. We have not provided. Request body we mentioned. Okay. This is before transformation. That means before doing any integration request transformations, so these are the default data that we have sent, and API gateway is now calling this Lambda function, which is the backend configured for this API. So these are the request parameters, and so this is the endpoint request body after transformation. We have not done any transformation in this case. It's a simple pass through. Then sending the request. So that means before sending the request to the backend, we are doing any transformation if you have configured already. So the receive response is 200, and the endpoint response headers are so and so, and endpoint response body before transformation. So that means whatever the Lambda sends, this is what it is. And method response body after transformation. So that means any integration response that we wanted to do before sending back the response to the client. So this is what it is after. And method response headers is this. So here the response is same as what Lambda sends back. Okay, we are not doing any change in this case. So finally the execution completed and the status code is 200. Okay, so this is how you can test a simple API in the console itself. Okay, now let us go to the console, and at the terminal also we will invoke some APIs through curl and check the same thing. Okay. So here, let us first run this command to get the URL that we need to call. Okay. So this is the URL for the API gateway, and I've created a simple JSON file as the sample data. So it is here. If you go to the Lab1 event, so you will see this is a sample data. Okay. Now we are simply doing a curl call to this URL. So if you look at the URL is basically the API gateway ID, the service name, region, and /dev stage and the specific endpoint. And the content type is the JSON file, and this is the input data. Okay. So let me just copy this and fire this API. Now you see that the status code is 200. This is the body of the response. This is exactly what we have seen in the console. Okay, so this is how you can test an API end to end, either through the console or through the command line through using the curl command. Okay, this concludes the lab 1, where we created our first API without any authorization, without any validation, without any API case. A simple plain API with a Lambda integration we have tested. Okay.